Hello, a very warm welcome to you. And today we will be looking at linear thought versus deep thought. I'd like to ask you whether you've ever considered the fact that there's more than one type of thought and more than one type of experience based on the many types of thoughts that we could have. To enlighten us further on the subject, I'd like to introduce you to our speaker, Sister Denise. Sister Denise, a very, very warm welcome.
Thank you.
Linear thought versus deep thought. Sister Denise, in the country from which I emanate, there's two different words for thought, but I notice in the English language it's not the case. Now, there is obviously more than one type of thought, isn't there?
Well, there's many different types of thoughts, and in several languages there are different words for different types of thoughts.
Yeah.
And if you look deeply into the English language, you've got cogitation, contemplation, musing, pondering, concentrating, and it's really how we proceed using our faculties of consciousness, because there are some thoughts that are very analytical, and for those thoughts we would say that's the intellect operating. And then for other thoughts, still the word thought, they would say the mind is working. And the mind and the intellect work together, so it can be very complicated to dissect,
Okay, Sister Denise, before we get there, what is the mind? I understand that there are some languages on the planet that don't even have a word for the mind. What is the mind, and what is its role as far as human functioning is concerned?
The human soul, when it's producing thoughts, then we will say that's the mind at work. And really, though we use the word mind as a noun, nobody's ever seen a mind. And everybody says, well, yeah, I have a mind. Where is your mind? Don't know. Somewhere in my head.
Yeah, lost your mind is a phrase that we use far too often.
Yes. And then you can have someone on your mind, you can have something in your mind, you could be out of your mind. There's all these things which have to do with this combination of the thoughts you produce, whether or not they're rational, logical, coherent, consistent, or what. Because it's this sort of the intellect part which determines whether it's coherent, consistent, and so on. But the mind is sometimes compared with a horse who just goes anywhere it wants, or the mind is often described as not having any discrimination. It creates good movies, bad movies, anything. It's just a prolific studio that just keeps on throwing up stuff like the Sorcerer's Apprentice,
So, sorry to interrupt you. So the mind is something within the human soul. Is it a...
I really don't think it's a thing, although we speak about it as a thing, but I see it more as a capacity to produce images, feelings, castles in the air.
Is the mind the stage, or is the mind the producer and the director?
I think it's all of it, It's like a space, the mind space into which ideas float. A lot of them coming from the subconscious. So you have your conscious mind, and then some people talk about the subconscious mind, and then maybe there's altered states of mind.
Okay, so the mind is a space where thoughts happen. You spoke of sense perceptions in the past. How do they impact, and where do they make themselves known?
Well, this is a great wonder. I mean, with your eyes, you get visual information that goes into your brain and appears in your mind as an image. And that image is interpreted as, I like it, I don't like it, I'm neutral about it, it's pretty, it's ugly. We have all these judgments about what we're perceiving and what it means. and how you should respond to it, or if you have to react to it, or should you forget it, should you entertain it, should you try and get rid of it. There's all these things that come in are just neutral, but as soon as they're in, they're not neutral anymore because of how you are. And then there's things that you hear, you see. And so you have a whole auditory mind. So your mind is full of sounds and images, fragrances, and then of course memories. And they all mix up with each other, and the mind operates by association. So a lot of psychologists and psychiatrists have been examining these things for a long, long time to try to figure out how the mind works, as if it's a thing, you know. Whereas for me, you can look at it as a thing, but I also look at it as a space where things arise, and then the intellect is more the part that organizes what's happening in the mind.
What? Sorry, you lost me. The mind is where things happen. Okay.
Thoughts arise, and
Okay.
the thoughts arise either from the subconscious or from sense perceptions. So they come in a big jumble, and the intellect decides, yeah, we want this, we don't want that, put this over here. It's the organizing principle, and it also determines whether a thought is true or false, relevant or irrelevant, useful, useless. We want it, we don't want it.
Okay, so your intellect is a what? Filter?
Well, it's the boss.
Okay.
And it organizes things into coherent, meaningful, usable things, because once things come into the mind, they tend to transfer themselves into words and actions, and they come out as karma. And then your karma comes back to you as consequences. The cycle, which is going on the inside of your being and on the outside of your being, and all of it is very complex, and a lot of it goes wrong a lot of time, which is why people try and figure it out. And so spiritual practice is very much to do with strengthening the intellect, because if the mind is the all-powerful one and it's out of control, and the intellect is the boss, and nobody's listening to what the boss is saying, he's going to run out tearing his hair, and then all the kids are going to do whatever they want. So it's rather like les enfants terribles, you know.
Right. Not familiar with that, but let's move on. Okay, Sister Denise. Linear thought and deep thought. Where does linear thought and deep thought fit into this picture?
Well, linear thought is what we normally do. And
You mean, when you say normally do, you mean from the time we wake up in the morning until the time we go to bed at night, our normal day-to-day functioning. I have to wake up now, let's have breakfast, I've got to meet this one at 10 o'clock for this appointment, that type of thoughts.
Not really. How we analyze the universe for ourselves, we do in a linear way, or we could do in a deep way. And we normally do in a linear way. You know, life, the universe, and everything. We look at it in a linear way. So we look at timelines. You know, the history started over here and it carries on endlessly over that way, and time is moving, you know, from left to right. I don't know, in some cultures it may be moving the other way, but usually over here we look at it that way. You're going from the past into the future. If you want to understand anything in the material world, you tend to look at it in a linear way. You look at where it starts. So you've got a seed, you know, it starts and it goes through to a fruit, and it'll end up as another seed, and then you plant that seed and it starts again. So you have a bit of an idea of a life cycle, but still you're looking at it in a relatively linear way, and you wouldn't extend that to something that is outside of your visual field. So linear thought is connected to how you perceive something through your sense organs. Scientific, normal, rational, coherent thinking about the phenomenal universe, which you can perceive through your sense perceptions, that's linear thought.
Sister Denise, I'm looking for synonyms for linear thought. Is it surface thought, superficial thought, or am I totally off the mark?
No, I think it's good. It is surface thought. It is one-dimensional thought. I mean, sometimes people make a comparison between linear thought and holistic thought.
Okay.
Where holistic thought is you look at the whole thing. And so linear thought would be connected more to the process by which you understand the universe through specialization. So for example, medicine is a good example, because you learn basic medicine and then you specialize, because the amount of information you're getting is so gigantic that you can't take all of it, so you specialize. And when you specialize and you go into the depth of the lungs, you know, and you don't know too much about the intestines or the feet or the eyes because you're a lung specialist. Linear thought tends to cause us to specialize.
Okay.
And what that means is it compartmentalizes us, and then we can't see the whole thing. You kind of specialize yourself so much that you lose sight of the whole, so you get holistic thought, which tries to connect you with the whole. But then deep thought, you go to other levels.
It's a vertical way of thinking.
Sure, I mean, yeah.
Okay, so Sister Denise, give us an example of deep thought. I assume that your spiritual practice only comprises of deep thought.
When you learn to think, we also call it circular thought.
Oh, hold on. Is circular thought different from linear and deep thought?
I think circular thought takes you to deep thought.
Oh, it's like before pressing on the accelerator, you start the car in order to idle.
Perhaps you could say that, but one other way to look at it is, okay, you want to think about non-physical realities, because you can't go very deep about the surface. Physical reality means the surface of things. So you want to go into the depth of love, which is a quality that's fairly intangible, that's very desirable, that comes fraught with problems and on and on. So you want to understand the depth of what exactly is love, or divine love. So you have to start circling around that word, circling around that idea, and as you circle around it, your mind starts to function more like a spiral, spiraling down, and you start to move away from the superficial attributes of love or associations, and you start to go deeper. And ultimately, if you stick with it, you arrive at exactly what love is like and feels like, and then what you end up with is a knowing. I call it a knowing. I know what is love because I have been all around it and I have arrived. You know.
Okay, so Sister Denise, the purpose of deep thought is to take you from an understanding into an experience. Imagery, and what comes to mind is Dante Alighieri's book, and more specifically a vortex. You keep
It is a vortex. You don't go from understanding to experience. I put understanding and experience on the same level, and what you go to is knowing, which is way deeper than experience.
To experience is to know, because you feel it at the core of your being.
Well, you see why we have such a problem with these words that are intangible. People will use them differently, but eventually we agree on our terms. But
Yes.
you know, in my own thinking, and when people are talking about an experience, they're talking about something that they feel, and they remember what that felt like. But I think that there's quite a qualitative difference between combining the understanding and the feeling as you go together, maybe like a DNA double helix, and you arrive at somewhere where you just know in the depth of your being what that is. So it's much deeper than understanding or experiencing.
I'm thinking of the Latin word scio. The word omniscient comes from there. Scio means I-S-C-I-O.
Yeah,
means
to know.
To know. Is that what you're referring to?
Probably, yeah.
Okay. Yes. Okay. Okay. Well, if you put it in that context, then that makes more sense to me than just the English.
Ah, great that we can speak Latin.
Well, I can't imagine that everybody watching us will speak Latin because, hello, it's no longer a spoken language. But
yeah, but you know, there are certain languages where these things were really gone into a lot by the thinkers and the philosophers, and in the same way Sanskrit has a lot of words for these things.
You are very obviously an intellectual. Now, there are many women who are deeply interested in spirituality who are not intellectual. And I am by no means being derogatory when I say this. I know a number of women who do not score intellectually, but who are wonderful human beings, who are simple in the way they think, and I'm not using simplicity as a synonym for stupidity. Does spirituality belong to intellectuals, or can somebody who's simple, doesn't have even tertiary education or any form of formal education, can she also not enjoy spirituality? Does it need such a level of thought? I mean, you can write a book on all that you know. Hint, hint. But you have applied your mind, you've spent years thinking about this, and you've taken your intellectual reasoning and you've transformed it into an experience, a knowing. What about women who aren't wired like you?
Well, you know, one thing we have to accept is that it takes all sorts to make a world.
That is true.
And so there's a bunch of intellectuals who will, you know, probably angle themselves towards spirituality that way. And there's people who are hands-on and they will angle that way. People who are simpler, people who are very complicated, artistic, scientific. There's every variety of person, and there's as many angles on spirituality as there are kinds of people. And I think it's part of one's investigation into oneself. We ask, you know, what am I? You know, and not only that, but, you know, in some societies, if you're an intellectual, that's really good. In other societies, if you're an intellectual, that's imprisonable.
Yes, that
you
is
know,
true.
so that's really bad. And in some societies, if you're a simple heart person, that's what we want. In others, heart people, we don't need that. That's not useful.
Sister Denise, how has understanding the difference between linear thought and deep thought served you specifically within your spiritual practice? How has it served you?
Well, I think the way it has worked is initially when I was educated, tertiary education, I was really learning how to apply linear thought. And it's a very different way of using your mind and intellect in your relationship with ideas and information, academic work, and so on. But when I started to learn spirituality and ways of thinking that were very different, it was a whole different way of using your mind and your intellect. And I know different languages, so when you speak one language, your whole musculature of your face is aligned to that language. And if you have to speak a different language, you're going to get face ache because you're using your muscles completely differently to speak the different language.
You're referring to phonetic sounds,
No.
or more than that?
How you shape your face to speak different languages. I mean, if I'm speaking English, I use one set of muscles. If I'm speaking French, it's a different set of muscles. If I'm speaking Hindi, it's another set of muscles. So I need 3 good set of facial muscles to be good at all those 3 languages. You probably don't know.
Well, yeah,
when you're speaking
this is news.
Afrikaans,
Okay, Sister Denise, this is news to me. News to me. I never thought I never put language and muscles in the same sentence before. So this is news to me. Okay, continue.
yeah, because language is a tongue, right?
Yeah.
Which is a muscle.
Okay. Okay.
Anyway, there are going to be people out there who are language teachers
Yes,
who know
will,
this stuff.
and who will identify with what you're saying.
Yeah, you use your mind, which is, and your intellect, which is another kind of muscle, in a very different way, you see. And so when you use your mind and intellect in a linear manner, you become adept at that. Then you have to use it in a different way. You have to start again from 0, like you're learning how to walk all over again. And then you kind of become good at both ways of thinking.
Sister Denise, when you're talking about the difference between linear and deep thought, is it just spirituality that causes you to do or go into deep thought, or is it any depth? I'm thinking of a woman who's watching you right now who is a neurologist.
Well, that is linear thought.
Is that linear thought? So she has gone into the depths of medicine, but
That's linear thought.
That is linear thought.
Well, let me give you another way of looking at it. Linear thought is analytical, and the other one is where you make like massive leaps of logic without actually being illogical, rather like time warps or space warps. You know, in science fiction they talk about that. It's a bit like that.
Right. Okay.
And also you bring in intuitive bits, and you put 2 and 2 together and make 150, but it's not illogical.
Deep thought is spirituality and nothing else but spirituality.
It's looking at existence from a spiritual angle, so that what you see is very different from when you look at existence from a rational angle, from a material angle.
How does experiencing deep thought change a person, enhance a person, bring someone closer to God?
Well,
What are the benefits?
Yeah, it gives you lots of dimensions to operate on. I think linear thought is a bit one-dimensional. You know, so you go into the depth of the self, you go into the depth of, you know, becoming neutral between good and evil, you know, that you don't find in linear thought. And this is why it's so complicated to bring in ethics into science, because science is non-ethical. But life has to have some kind of ethics. Whereas with linear thought, it's all one thing, and you don't have a problem of combining what is there with, you know, rightness and wrongness, goodness and badness. It's not a complicated problem.
Okay, so any last thoughts for the viewer before we say goodbye to you today?
I think one thing that we might say is that linear thought deals only with the tangible realities, whereas what we're calling deep thought, we might find a better word for it, I don't know, but it's dealing with the material and the non-material dimensions of thought.
Okay, Sister Denise, you've given our viewers lots to think about, and which includes myself. So thank you, Sister Denise. There you have it, the difference between linear thought and deep thought. Most of us have not actually considered the difference between the two before, perhaps because it was not presented in the way that Sister Denise just has. But I do invite you to spend time with yourself, introspect, and ask yourself how much time you spend in linear thought and how much time you spend in deep thought. And what I find attractive about deep thought is that it offers you different dimensions. I like the way Sister Denise put that. Very profound. And I think it is a very important journey into self-discovery and understanding yourself at your core and re-establishing your relationship with the divine. I think within spirituality, one can get that, which you can get in no other way. So thank you for spending this half an hour with us, and I do hope you've taken some benefit from this show. Take care, and we will see you soon. Goodbye.